Good afternoon. My name is Shirley Malcolm, and I head Education and Human Resources Programs here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. We are happy to once again be partnering with the Senior Scientists and Engineers STEM Volunteer Program during their annual meeting. Last year, we had a very spirited and informative session. Once again, we have a very spirited and informative session planned for you. So I would just mention that we are going to have a panel that focuses on the next generation science standards, moving from the framework to the classroom. And then we will move off, and then the next panel related to STEM professionals and teachers partnering to improve K-12 science education will then come up to the stage and begin that particular discussion. I would like to introduce our panelists and tell you a little bit about the format. I think this has been a very big couple of days, week, for science education in this country. With the release of the 8th grade NAEP in science, and then the release of the next gen draft for a comment. And so given that all of this is going on, we're going to try to position this discussion in a way where we can begin to understand what is happening, what is being done, what the plans are, how we're going to move ahead, and how we in fact get from the framework to the classroom. In this particular case, we have 3 excellent presenters who will help us to try to understand this, starting with very brief remarks from Heidi Schweingruber, Deputy Director of the Board on Science Education at the National Research Council. Remember, the National Research Council oversaw the framework development process, and with that once that was done, it was handed off to Achieve. And our next speaker, Steve Pruitt, who is Vice President for Content Research and Development at Achieve. And so the process for getting to the standards came next. And then we, both of those individuals, after they have made very brief presentations, will join Anita O'Neill and myself in a panel discussion. We want to spend most of the time in discussion. We will first have a little bit of back and forth with each other, and then we're going to open up the floor for you to get in on the discussion and to ask questions. Now, I will say that we are really fortunate to have Anita. Anita knows us. She knows AAAS and she knows SSE. We have had a long-term relationship and partnership with the Montgomery County Schools, and Anita, as the Supervisor for Science, Technology, and Engineering in the Montgomery County Public Schools, is very much aware of what it's going to take to turn those standards into reality in the classroom. And so I hope that this kind of conversation, and we want it to be a conversation, that this kind of conversation will help us to understand the processes that we have to go through, how all of us fit into that process, and what we might do to actually facilitate a smooth launching of this process within the classroom. So we're going to hear first from Heidi, and then when she finishes her remarks, we're going to hear from Steve, and his remarks are going to be brief. And then we're going to have our panel with our comments. And so, Heidi.
I really want to give you a very brief overview of the framework. I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with it. The framework for K-12 science education was developed by an 18-member expert committee at the National Research Council. And it's really the blueprint for the next generation science standards, which Stephen will tell you about, which were released in a first draft form this past Friday. So, too loud. slide shows you a bit about the history of the development here. You're probably all aware that in the 1990s we had two sets of standards that were at the national level designed to guide what happens in science education K-12, the benchmarks from AAAS and the AAAS, as well as the National Science Education Standards from the NRC. Since that time, there's actually been a lot of research on teaching and learning in science, and much of that has been summarized in reports from the Board on Science Education at the NRC. Taken together, those documents fed into the framework, which I'm going to tell you about, and then that framework, as I said, was the blueprint for the next generation science standards. So this is a real quick overview of the framework. I think in the interest of time, I won't read these individually, but the framework is based in a set of principles that come from that research base that I alluded to. It indicates that kids can start learning science in sophisticated ways early on, and that you want to build systematically over time. So the framework is designed around 3 dimensions, and this again is based on research. The first is science and engineering practices, and these are really the things that you do when you do science and engineering. So the philosophy here is kids are going to learn science and engineering through engaging in doing science and engineering. So it's not tell me the content, I'll memorize it, and then I'll understand science. It's that I have to engage in these things to really understand what they're about and how knowledge is built and problems are solved through science and engineering. The second dimension is called cross-cutting concepts. These are really the ideas that go across the disciplines and across engineering and really knit together science and engineering as coherent endeavors. So these really help students start to see how the separate disciplines are actually connected through this kind of connective tissue. And finally, the disciplinary core ideas. This is where you'll see some of the content that we typically think of as content, but it's framed around broad overarching concepts, which are designed to give kids sort of a deeper understanding and a more flexible understanding to leverage their future learning. So I'm going to quickly go through these 3 dimensions. It's important, I'm walking you through these because these are really the foundational elements of the next generation science standards. So these 3 dimensions are then knit together to create the performance expectations that are in the next generation science standards, and Stephen will be very explicit about how that's done. So this is the set of practices in science and engineering, and I should note that this is really a move forward to combine science and engineering in these standards. They actually were in the National Science Education Standards and the benchmarks, but it turns out when states implemented them, that piece was often left out completely. So even though they were in those national level documents, it didn't get implemented. So here they're really intertwined, and the notion is we really need to attend to both. And so in looking at what scientists and engineers do, the committee really saw a lot of similarity, but also a couple places where there are differences in how scientists and engineers go about their work. The first is, you'll see in the first practice listed here, asking questions and defining problems. You can see the distinction between science and engineering there. And the other place you'll see the distinction is in practice 6. Otherwise, there's a lot of similarities between the practices in the 2 fields. I should point out that the numbers here are for convenience only. This isn't like the 5-step scientific method where the impression is that you do the same steps no matter what. This is really seen as an iterative process. They're numbered for convenience, but the notion is at various points in time in doing a scientific investigation and in building scientific knowledge, you're going to do a variety of these things. Not all of these are currently represented in science classrooms, and so there's going to be some need for professional development to really help teachers understand how to support this full range of practices. I just wanted to point out, you may be aware there's also the Common Core standards in math and English language arts, and this slide shows that these practices, while they're kind of a push on current instructional practice, and they're kind of a new feature, they actually also appear in the Common Core math and the English language arts. A similar set of things appear in each. So the move is very similar. There's a parallel push in terms of what we want to see in terms of change in the classroom. So the cross-cutting concepts are these sort of concepts that connect across the disciplines, and I think if you look at this list, you'll see how they actually apply in physics and chemistry and the geosciences. These actually are familiar from the benchmarks and the National Science Education Standards. These kind of took from those 2 documents and are put together. This set of concepts is designed over time. Kids will develop a deeper understanding of them. The notion is that these really give you a lot of leverage for future learning. So for example, if you start to understand what a system is, how it works, and the kinds of questions you can ask about it, when you encounter a new phenomena or a new situation and you understand it's a system, you automatically have this cascade of things you can ask about it and ways that you can investigate. And so it really gives you a lot of leverage to develop these cross-cutting concepts. I'm moving on to the disciplinary core ideas. I won't go into detail on this slide, but the notion is that there was a real effort on the part of the committee to narrow and deepen what's covered. So we have this understanding that the science curriculum and the math curriculum too in the United States has tended to be a mile wide and an inch deep. And so the notion is this new set of standards should focus on a core set of ideas where you get your most bang for the buck and go more deeply and in a more sustained, coherent way over time. So the committee knew they had to have a systematic way of identifying those ideas, largely to explain what was left out. And so this is the set of criteria that the committee used. I'll note the first two bullets, to me, really go to sort of the explanatory power of this idea in the discipline and the way that it can be used as a tool for solving future problems and understanding phenomena. The last two, I think, relate more to sort of teaching and learning and how you reach the students and how you make sure that the ideas you're engaging them with can sort of have a sustained treatment over multiple grades. So a quick walk through these core ideas. I should point out, again, what I'm listing here on the slide are these top-level core ideas in each of the disciplines. You can see the first set, PS 1, 2, 3, and 4, are the physical sciences. The next set are the life sciences, and the next slide will have some more in other disciplines. These are really short stems. The committee was even nervous to put these titles on because they really give short shrift to what's in the document, a much richer description of these overarching concepts. And so I would encourage you to look at the document for a fuller appreciation of what this is really capturing. Underneath each of these core ideas, there are what are called component ideas, which break down what does it take to really understand this overarching idea. And so these, I'm sure, look somewhat familiar if you've seen other standards and are familiar with what's covered. I should note there's no assumption here that each idea gets equivalent instructional or curricular time. So there's recognition. These are the ideas you need to touch on. It could be that some will take longer over a period of time. There's also not an order of curriculum implied here. So if you think about it, these ideas are identified across K-12, but in any given grade or in any given grade band, these aren't dictating an order. So there's going to have to be some thought into how that's put together, and certainly that's a challenge that we've left for the standards designers. So here are the ideas in earth and space sciences, and then you see two core ideas in engineering, technology, and applications of science. So you saw engineering both in the practices, but there's also recognition that there's some knowledge that you have to have when you engage in engineering design and problem solving. And so this first core idea highlights that, and the second then looks at what are the links between engineering science and applied science. So I wanted to emphasize that the framework pushes on the idea that even though these dimensions are laid out separately in the document, that's for clarity, and when you're moving toward implementation, first in the standards, then in curriculum assessment, professional development, they need to be intertwined. So again, this is the idea that you're learning these ideas and the concepts as you engage in the practices. So it's no longer the notion that you could do a chapter on inquiry in September, and then you've taken care of the inquiry part, and then you just shovel the content in. The idea is you're actually learning these ideas by doing the science. And so they really have to be intertwined. And again, that's another challenge for the standards writers. So what's new here as we move from the existing standards and existing practice is the central role of practices. Now, inquiry was an emphasis in previous documents, and we're not abandoning inquiry. This is really a refinement and a better articulation of what are these specific things that kids need to do to engage in inquiry. The second is this organization around cross-cutting concepts and core explanatory ideas, the ideas that you want to target these overarching concepts and ideas that give you the biggest bang for your buck in learning and in future learning. And then organized in learning progressions is the idea about coherence across grades. So it's being very thoughtful about how you sequence things so that kids are really building knowledge. And you can really see this at the K-5 level now in many places where there's not necessarily a coherent sequence in science, and you might get little topics or little themes where you do rainforest, weather, whales. What's the connection between those? Not necessarily clear. So this is to be really thoughtful about sequencing. And that's it, and I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Thanks, Heidi. I'm going to walk you through where we are in the draft and some nuances as we have thought about this going forward, and also to kind of walk you through a little bit of the development process so you know how that's all working. So I've got a few points that I want to make. The first point is it's a draft. Okay, and what that means is that we will make change based on the feedback. So we are very much committed to the fact that we know we haven't gotten it all right yet. So in a few minutes when we open this up, if you decide that you want to proceed to start throwing things at me, it's okay. Preferably not really hard or really sharp. But the fact is we know that there's still a lot of work to do, but we're at a point now where we feel like we need more input than just from the states and from the writers. So just some details is, we are going to have 2 public releases for this, which means, at least I hope what it means to you is that we are taking feedback seriously, because we're going to release it, take feedback, release it again, not as a final, but as another draft, so that people can tell us again, hey, we told you to change this, and you did or you didn't. And then we'll move toward a final, but it is something that we want to be a very transparent process, and one that we want as many people as possible to comment on. The standards were released on May 11th. That was last Friday at 3 o'clock. At 3:10, and I'm not exaggerating, we had more than 10,000 unique visitors to the website. There was a little interest. In fact, on Monday between 10 and 11:30, we had 42,000 hits on the website. So it's actually a pretty interesting thing for a lot of people. In fact, it was actually kind of funny. We were watching the Twitter feed, and there were people saying, it looks like the site's refreshing. It's about to come out. People were so excited. You can go and see these at nextgenscience.org. The review period will end on June 1st. It is a state-led process, and the reason why that's important is just like with Common Core, the states are the ones that have to adopt these. So this is not something that we could undertake with just the NRC and just achieve. This had to be something that really engaged states. The great thing about the NRC, and to be clear, the partnership that occurred to develop the framework between NRC, AAAS, NSTA, and Achieve was that it really gave states a lot of legitimacy and authority to be able to go forward with this. There's a few issues in science that are a little controversial, if you're not aware of that. And it actually was important for states to have the scientific community saying this is what's important. However, as we move toward standards, the states have to take more of a lead. So we have 26 states that are called lead state partners. We sent out an application. We said, who wants to be a lead state partner? To do that, you had to do a few things, including commit to give serious consideration to adoption as presented and convene this broad-based committee. And we ended up with 26 states, which encompass 58% of the public school population. They have reviewed 2 rounds of the draft already. We've had over 1,000 people already review the draft before we went public. And so they've been very active in that. Our writing team is 41 members strong. It has K-5, 6, 8, 9, 12, practicing scientists, practicing engineers, arts and science faculty, science education faculty, so students with disability background, English language learning, so it's a pretty diverse group. Critical stakeholders that also give us feedback on the draft or on various drafts as they come out. And of course, we don't want Heidi to get bored, so we make sure that the NRC stays involved, as does several members from AAAS. So our logo reflects the vision of the framework, and that is that what's really new about this is that science education has to occur at the nexus between practice, content, and cross-cutting concepts, because it provides a better context for kids. So this is called a performance expectation. Before we go too far, let me say, I know half of you love the color, half of you hate the color. It's okay. Online, you can click a button that says black and white. But for presentation purposes, I want to show you this quickly because again, I know that we haven't gotten it all right. That's why we need the feedback. But the focus here is to blend these 3 dimensions together so that it gives a very clear outcome of what students would have to perform to show proficiency. Now, just so you know, if you're not real familiar with current state standards, all you would get would be the statement that's in blue, orange, and green. And to be perfectly honest with you, there wouldn't be any blue. The blue is the science and engineering practice. I'm going to actually show you an example in just a second. It would just say something like students know, or students can explain, or students do something, but then the inquiry part would come somewhere else. And then everybody would have to unpack the standard, which is a horrible, horrible word, because everybody does it a million different ways, and everybody has different expectations, and that's one of the reasons we've ended up with 50 different sets of standards, because people have been unpacking all over the place. So in red, there are clarification statements that can give examples and give specific guidance. And then there's an assessment boundary that speaks to assessment developers that says, stay out of that area, because there's some areas that, because of the research that we have and because of some professional experience that we have, we know that there are certain things that don't need to be addressed at various grade bands. These are called foundation boxes. These come directly out of the framework for K-12 science education. On the web, you can actually click on the blue, green, or orange box and go directly to the page on the framework to get even more detail than what's listed here. These are what the standard was written from. This is actually where I kid about the fact that we don't want everybody to unpack, because to write the performance, we had to pack. So we just kept the suitcase open so everybody saw how we did it. These 3 boxes really should be the foundation for a criteria, for the rubric, for how you really judge if a student really is able to show proficiency. The blue is science and engineering practice, the orange are the disciplinary core ideas, and green are the cross-cutting concepts. Those are the things that kids would need to show evidence of understanding. And then, just to be clear, again, that comes word for word out of the grade band endpoints. These 2 boxes actually are they're from the framework, but they've been expanded because the framework ran out of time. They didn't have time to do grade band endpoints for practice and for cross-cutting, so we've had to do that. You have an opportunity online to also comment on that and tell us things that we might need to change there. Finally, there's a set of connections boxes. You can look at the connections in the same grade level, and you can click on the web and go back and forth. You can see the articulation of the disciplinary core ideas across time. So if you're in middle school, like this is a middle school example, you can see what they did with structure and properties of matter in elementary and what they will do in high school. And then the connections to the Common Core state standards. We're very committed to ensuring that the Common Core, or that science does not require a skill prior to what kids will be learning in their math and language arts classes. This is an example of the matrix for science and engineering practice. It shows how there's a progression across time. I know you can't read these, so I'm not really stopping, and I'm trying to be brief. Cross-cutting matrix is the same thing. Here are 2 examples. Another part that's a little different is that in the same box as the cross-cutting, but they're not cross-cutting concepts, are where we've tried to integrate engineering into the performance expectations. But they're somewhat treated as cross-cutting, but they're actually not cross-cutting as defined by the NRC, but they are how to integrate engineering throughout the performance expectations. So a few things that we have to try to help people shift their mental thoughts on and their conceptual model. First of all is this idea that we do have to integrate. It's unfortunate, but we've seen through documentation and through state assessment that we don't always integrate these ideas of practice and content, much less cross-cutting concepts. So we have to help people start to see that that is actually the critical component here, and that's what the new vision really shows. The other part is that because the performance expectations identify a particular practice with a particular content, doesn't mean that that's the only one you do with the content. These standards will take us to a higher threshold, but it's still a threshold. There's no way you can teach how to construct and use a model in a 2-week time period. You've got to do that through the whole year. But by the end of the year, the student may be using that modality with a particular content in a large-scale assessment. Science concepts build over time, and they build coherently over time. We are taking a lot of care, not in this draft, but in the November draft that will come out later. Obviously later, because it'll be November. You'll see a strand map that actually shows how all the performance expectations lead up to the disciplinary core ideas. We just simply ran out of time. We just simply couldn't get that. Not to mention if you think about how you make brownies, right now we're in the mix part. We haven't really gotten firm yet, so there's a lot of things still moving around. They will focus on deeper understanding and application of content. So The little bitty details are not the focus. It's using the science to be able to apply to new and unique situations. Integrating science and engineering is something very new for our science teachers. It's something we're going to have to help them see the importance and help them see really how to do it. And then, of course, the coordination with Common Core. Unfortunately, in a lot of state standards, when the science standards are developed, they don't necessarily look at the math and language arts. What we say and what you see with the Venn diagram is we have a real opportunity to educate a whole child as opposed to pieces of that child. So here's what I'd like to show you. So I'm about to show you a comparison. This is an existing set of state standards on structure and properties of matter. And here are performance expectations from structure and properties of matter in the NGSS. It may be a little hard to read, but hopefully you can. Hopefully you can take a really quick look and notice that there's some real differences here. First, I'll point out, look at the verbs on the left. Distinguish, describe, describe, distinguish, distinguish, recognize, and identify, and demonstrate. Not necessarily really high rigor verbs. This is one example, and you can say, oh, well, our state didn't do that. Yeah, they did. Most states, there are definitely states out there who have excellent standards, who have great verbs and all that, but one thing that's a lot different here is when you operate actually in this nexus, look at the verbs in the NGSS. Construct and use models to explain. Plan investigations to generate evidence. Use simulation or mechanical models to determine. Construct an argument that explains. That's a very different way of thinking, and it actually takes us to a different cognitive level than what most states, and I think I could fair to say all states, have not really taken us to. The other fact is this. The state that's on the left, they have a set of inquiry standards, but guess what gets assessed? Those. The idea behind operating at this nexus is twofold. Not only at the classroom level should kids be learning through those practices, the only way to keep people honest, at least this is the current feeling, is that you put the practices in the performance expectations and say, kids are going, you can't pull those apart anymore. The assessments are going to have to be developed in more of a performance-based manner. The standards are organized similar to the framework in that you can see them by discipline, but actually, if you go to the web, you see that we tried to be the Burger King of standards delivery and let you have it your way. You can rearrange them in any way you want to do that. K-5 is grade by grade. 6, 8, 9, 12 are grade banded. The reason for that is that there's a great deal of diversity in how people handle their middle school and high school. By the time we get to the November draft, you will see some draft course pathways of how students could meet those standards over time. The second point is it's a draft. I just want to be real clear about that. This is our website. This is the front page of the website. I really encourage you to read the stuff to the left. If nothing else, read how to read the standards in the front matter. If you don't want to read any of the other stuff, that's up to you, but it's really important that you understand kind of the philosophy behind how this works. Really would appreciate people reading the conceptual shifts too, to be honest with you. You can search by topic. Now, they're not necessarily the traditional topics. They're the topics that kind of bubbled up as the standards were being written. You can also search by individual performance expectation, by grade level. You can see all the ones that have the practice of posing questions, K to 12, or you can look at what in middle school had using mathematical thinking. The part that I want to get close to finishing up here is the fact that I want everybody that I ever speak to know, we don't look at this as we're going to develop a document, send it out there and say good luck. These 26 states serve a greater function than just to review. We're working with them to do adoption and implementation planning, which we can then expand to other states. Just because 26 states are lead states, there's a separate initiative going on, which we're also a part of, that 41 states are sending teams of 5 to talk about how to adopt and what needs to be developed to adopt and implement the standards. Science education policy, we need to continue to talk about that, because if you adopt the standards but there's nothing that requires you to take the standards, we've not really made much progress. College and career readiness is another aspect that we will really start a validation process in June to move forward on that, to see how we need to change the draft high school standards to really meet college and career readiness. And then we work with the states to develop state coalitions and champions so that they actually have support as the standards are being adopted and implemented. My last point, can you guess what it is? It's draft. Please go to the website, give us your feedback. This is my contact information. I'm always happy to answer your questions. It's up to you, Anita. Or do we go to you first? Okay.
Okay, so now I get to ask questions, and I want to basically start with Anita, because you've heard this, you've seen this. We got the NAEP results out last week, and we didn't get much movement from the last time the test was given. And the interesting, and maybe not, I shouldn't say on the thing, maybe it wasn't unexpected, is that we really didn't get a lot of movement in terms of kids moving into proficient. And maybe there's a relationship here between what we're asking them, what we're teaching them, and what we're asking them. But I'd like Anita to start off on this, really, because you are the one who's basically closest to the teachers and the kids with regard to seeing progress or not seeing progress. And I'd really like your input on this.
Okay. Well, first I want to say I wish this work had been done about 4 years ago, completed, and then it would have made my work the last 4 years a lot easier.
Me too.
Because we've been trying to tackle a lot of the issues that were brought up in Stephen and Heidi's presentations in terms of changing practice in the classroom. So to kind of get to your point about the lack of movement, if you do the same thing, do you really expect different results? And so I think in terms of the framework and the standards, I believe those are the foundational pieces to allow those movements, the changes in practices for the adults working with the students to happen. But it's really what's going to happen with those documents, the curriculum that's developed, the professional development that happens. It has to be ongoing professional development. We have to look at teacher preparation programs. We need to start teaching teachers the way we would like to see them teaching our students. And until all those pieces are in place, we're not going to see much movement. So I feel like these are the foundational pieces. If we're all getting on the same page and we're all speaking the same language and have the same vision for our students to be global, critical thinkers to take care of us, as we age. But really, that's our goal, the critical thinking, problem solving, and these are the foundational pieces.
Yeah, Steve, you mentioned a number of different pieces that are going to have to basically come together that you're going to continue to be involved in. Obviously, one of those parts is state policy. Not everybody's going to sign on. Even if they sign on, not everybody's going to do it. So the question then becomes, what kind of thing could the community, basically the rest of us, engage in to try to get movement, state acceptance, and then state behavior?
Well, the fact that we're coming on the cusp of Common Core is a benefit. A lot of reasons. One being it's always good to be the second person to walk through the minefield. We learned a lot in that process. But I think the thing with state policy and being a recovering state policy maker myself, there's a lot of inertia in making those changes. And science has not been something that has been in the national discussion before. Right. I mean, it's been math and language arts. And even with Common Core, we have states that are still struggling with their state policies that are going to be requiring that every child take certain levels of math, certain levels of language arts. So as a community, for you, the thing that is always underestimated, I think, is the ability of external groups to really motivate state policymakers, because, and there's a magic in how you do it. I mean, you can come off as being, you just should do it because I say so, but there's also the way to do it that says, we as a community believe strongly this is the way this has to work. That's one of the reasons why one of our big quadrants is state support. Because when a state starts to think about moving from 2-year high school graduation requirements in science to a 3 or 4 year, and then on top of that actually saying kids have to finish these standards. So not just saying they need to take 3 lab sciences, but actually say they're going to take 3 sciences and they will have these standards. Part of what's going to have to help that movement is this organization of scientists saying this is the right thing. I know, again, for me, as a policymaker, it was a really big deal in Georgia when the scientists stood up together and said, hey, we want our science standards to have evolution in them, because Georgia hadn't really had that before. So it's a real powerful thing when the scientific community and the business community step up and say this is the right thing to do, because it takes it out of what people perceive as just education perpetuating itself.
Yeah, well, Heidi, I want to go to you because I heard Anita say something that I want to bring back around. One of the things that she said was that in order to make these changes and make them stick over the long term, there's going to have to be a different way that teachers are educated. And one of the things that she mentioned specifically was the need for teachers to be taught in the way that we're going to ask them to teach, as opposed to being taught to teach in a particular way. Now that means, this means that the onus is really on the higher ed community. So we're talking about faculty of science in our universities and colleges, which is now starting to get to our people, your and my people, okay? And the other part is I want to pick up on something that Steve said, which was instead of saying, well, you have to have 3 years of whatever, of laboratory science, if you all of a sudden say you have to, we want people to focus on the standards, that means that in some cases, you're not so siloed with regard to the disciplines. Now, that again gets to your people and my people. So I would want you to react to that.
Sure. I mean, I think in terms of supporting, is this on? Okay. I think in terms of supporting teachers, it is the higher ed faculty, but we also have to think about teachers who are already in the classroom and how we do professional development to support them. But turning to the idea of particularly the pre-service, it's very clear that the experiences that a lot of those pre-service teachers are having in their college and university classrooms doesn't at all model what we're suggesting in the Next Generation Science Standards and the framework. What's promising to me is there is a discussion at the national level about improving the way science instruction and engineering instruction is carried out in undergraduate classrooms, with a real emphasis actually on exactly the kinds of approaches that would fall out of what is the vision of the framework of the Next Generation Science Standards. So moving from only lecture models where you're telling the content to really thinking through how do you engage students actively in thinking about this. And in the case of the framework and the Next Generation Science Standards, that's the practices that actively engages. And so we've actually made a concerted effort to reach out to the higher ed community and share this whole development with them, and particularly the framework, and started some conversations about what does this mean for what you do in pre-service. In terms of, I think, reaching out to the folks who are specifically responsible for pre-service training, there's a lot of possibility and promise. The broader array of higher ed faculty in science and engineering is going to be more difficult. There's a large change that will need to happen in terms of the instruction that's offered in your basic science classes, where that's where the teachers are learning the science. There might be learning pedagogy somewhere else. So there is a big challenge, but there is some movement afoot to make it happen.
I thank you for mentioning the fact that there's a lot of movement already. And I would highlight for the audience the PCAST report on higher ed, which immediately pointed to the challenge that we have, especially at those intro courses that introduce people, to bring people into the topic and the fact that teachers are going to pick up bad habits, essentially, if they're not taught in a way that we want them to teach when they go into the classroom. But let me introduce another challenge for you, for all of you, and this is that the standards, draft next generation standards.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Carry with them an element with regard to engineering. And there are very, very few teachers who are sitting in classrooms who have had any interaction whatsoever with engineering ideas, principles, design. That presents a real challenge. One way to begin to address that may, in fact, be that we have to have something that is essentially the equivalent of Engineering 101 that's not for engineers, or in 102, et cetera. Another possibility is that we begin to bring engineers into the classroom, as a first step in terms of interacting with teachers of science. And I would just like to get some sense from you, all three of you, about how any of this might work. Anita, you want to kick off?
Well, that's why I'm sitting here smiling, because we've actually taken this challenge on, again, as early or as late as 4 years ago. We saw a need because of our STEM vision in our district to start, again, if the standards were out, we would have been, oh, we're right. But we started integrating engineering design into our K-8 science. And maybe there's a couple of teachers here, so maybe they've been victims of our risk-taking, and maybe they can react to that. But it was sort of this, what, now we need to be engineers? And that was the first year, but now we see a lot of enthusiasm with our teachers because they see the payoff for student learning. Our curriculum is designed to be problem-based so that the relevancy and the application are front-loaded. It's not the, you're going to learn all this, and then I promise you're going to need it later. So it's been very purposeful in the design, and we've sort of pared down the design process at elementary to really helping them understand 4 basic steps, and then it's beefed up in middle school and high school. And the flip side of that is in our engineering and tech ed classes, we've been bringing more science in, so what's good for one group is good for the other group. But able to help build our teachers and talk about professional development. Professional development isn't just always in the form of a course. We're lucky enough to have partnerships to send teachers out in the summer for a week or two to actually work with practicing engineers and see what their work is like, and really understanding what engineers are. We're lucky enough through our partnership to bring engineers into our classrooms to partner with our teachers, and we're going to hear in our panel some examples of that as well. So it's a lot of that exposure in many different ways, and that sort of eases the road. But the first reaction is, what?
I won't lie, that the introduction of engineering was a very difficult thing even for the writing team. How do you do it? How do you set up a scenario that it doesn't become the new inquiry? That was kind of our in all of our meetings, that was one of our mantras, was how do we prevent engineering from becoming the new inquiry or the new scientific method, or method, as I call it. And how do you do that? And we've really grappled with that, and I think we've made a lot of headway. I'm really excited to see in the draft how people react to it. But I know that we spent really almost a year getting prepared with the writing team before the framework came out so that we could hit the ground running, and it's a challenge.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on something Anita said, which was this idea that at the K-8, there was a slightly different strategy than there might be at the high school. And I think that's an important thing to think about, is the framework and certainly the standards don't dictate a single way that this needs to happen across different schools and districts and course sequences. And so thinking about, in some places you have career and tech ed teachers who have really strong courses, and helping those people more explicitly bring in the science might be a strategy. And so I've certainly had people ask me, does this mean I'm not going to be certified in chemistry and I suddenly have to be certified in a variety of, no, absolutely not necessarily. And so, and we can think about the elementary teachers. I think at first it's a shock, but I often think because of how kids respond, it's actually incredibly exciting. And the implementation of the Common Core math, I suspect, will actually make it somewhat easier for teachers to get their heads around this move to practice and the engineering, because it's going to be calling for some of the same ways of changing up what they're doing in the classroom.
You know, let's shift to a discussion of more practical things, okay? Because we talked about policy but let's talk about practical things. You have a draft of the first or 2.1, whatever it is, draft of the Next Gen standards. So the question is, what do you do with that, Anita?
What do we do with it? Well, I can tell you, we're going to go back to the framework and then come back to the draft of the standards. As soon as the framework was released, and actually prior to that, some of the work that Heidi had done at NRC with some of her colleagues, we really embraced the work, brought it in, and started having focus group discussions with my team, teacher leaders, and other individuals who will be impacted by the frameworks. We first tried to understand where we were going, and we've been following the standards very closely to think about the work we've been doing, where we're going, and start trying to do a gap analysis. And that's sort of the phase we're in now. We understand in general terms where the standards are going to end up, the integration of the practices with the content. And Maryland state standards, they're separate. We have a whole standard for inquiry, and then everything else is content. And that's not how we've been trying to implement our standards in Montgomery County. So what we're doing now is looking at that draft and looking at courses and looking at curriculum we have out and trying to identify places that we know we're going to either need to shore up or places that just need to be left to the side. So that's sort of the first, I guess, way we're really trying to understand what's in the standards and how it might impact our work. But it's really a lot of analysis and discourse. I don't recommend, and I don't think we'll hear from you, that you just jump in and start, okay, we've got them, we're going to start writing curriculum. I mean, step one is really understanding what that work is and how it impacts what you've done in the past. Because the worst thing to do is to just throw out all the work that's been done and say, okay, we're starting over. If you want teachers to really not embrace new standards, that's the way to do that.
So what comes after then?
After we've done the analysis,
After you've done that
then I
analysis.
think then we get into the curriculum revision, and all along while this is going on is professional development. You do not wait until the curriculum is developed. I know people thought I was like fooling them. For a year, I've been saying, next generation science standards, please make sure you're following, make sure you're going on checking, the website, because they're coming. Our newsletter last week, they're here. Because we've really tried to educate our teachers and administrators in our district for the last year about the wave that's coming, and showing them this is the work that we've been doing for 4 years, and this is where we expect it's going. Again, I think it's very important to highlight what's not new, because people need to feel comfortable about the things they've been doing, but how it's going to shift, and what's the payoff for students? What's the ultimate goal? And then we get into the curriculum writing and the assessments and all those fun things, which honestly I think are probably some of the easier tasks beyond changing behavior and educating people. I think actually writing the curriculum might be one of the easier tasks for us.
Okay, now, Steve, tell me that every school system has an Anita.
Are you going to make me take truth serum first? No, not everybody has an Anita. I wish we could do that. we'd be in a lot better case. My kid goes to Montgomery County School, so I could vouch for the work that she's doing. Again, it's one of the things that we're working with the states to do that I say in just about every speaking engagement, every meeting I'm in with states is they really need to have the courage to be patient. That sounds a little funny, but what that means is that historically when states finish a set of standards, they adopt them. All right, let's implement them next fall. And we'll try to figure out how we're going to do professional development before then. We'll try to figure out how we'll do assessment. And we have a great opportunity here. Right now, states need to be focused on Common Core. If that fails, NGSS probably won't be very far behind. That's where their energy needs to be. However, the courage to be patient means that they are very deliberate, thoughtful, and consider all of the different infrastructures that need to be built to have a successful implementation. And for some states, and in the case of Montgomery County, they can implement in the fall, but the states that are out ahead, let them go. But some states may need to take a couple of years and say, you know, we're not ready for this. We've got to build in this professional development opportunity. We've got to get money from our legislature to do this, that, or the other. But the key part of this that I just think is so important is patience, thoughtfulness, and consideration.
And I was just gonna say, and have a plan.
Let me just follow up on this, though. As you say, patience, I mean, I agree with you that it takes time, and it's going to take time and take more time in some places than others, okay? But what do I say to the people out here? What do I really say to myself while at the same time I'm willing to exercise patience? I'm feeling an incredible sense of urgency.
Well, there's a difference in a sense of urgency and patience, right? I mean, there's been a lot of things done in state government that was done on a sense of urgency that created nuclear meltdowns in schools across their state. If you don't have a sense of urgency, because I don't want you to conflate the two, having the courage to be patient means that you are still working toward the implementation. You are focused on that, but it doesn't mean that you're going to just implement and say, I hope you do okay, because that's where everything will fail. That's where we'll end up going back to what we've done for the last 20 years and having kids memorize just the 4 phases of mitosis and think that miraculously they're biologists. So it's a much bigger aspect of a sense of urgency combined with a really thoughtful and deliberate process. And so in fact, I'm glad you said that, because I've actually had people say, I heard you say go slow. That's not what I said. What I said was go deliberate. Think about what you're doing.
But be careful with that word deliberate. I have experience with it.
Well, I just want to say, I think what it's underscoring is the need for a plan. So underneath what Anita's saying is, I don't know whether it's written down, but there's clearly a very thoughtful, step-by-step, here's the arena we need to influence first, and here's where we can go next, and really thinking it through. And so the urgency is channeled into, what's the first arena we need to influence? So it's not that the only influence is to get that teacher in front of the classroom doing exactly what you want them. It's understanding the context that teacher is in, the policies that need to be in place, the kinds of supports they need, and you operate on those first. So I think it's channeling the urgency toward that well-thought-through plan. So for example, getting support behind adoption of Common Core, being an advocate at your local or state level for saying this is important is a good step. Turning people toward the draft of the next generation standards and giving constructive feedback on the first draft is a good way to channel the urgency. So
after having read the framework.
After having read the framework and
least
the
the
how to
vision
read
chapter.
the standards guide, right?
Okay.
So that's,
Now, let me just ask, are there questions that you want to ask each other before I go out here?
Have you looked into cloning? Just checking.
Okay. All right, line up at the mic. We want to be able to hear you. See, I got the urgency thing out before you guys did. Okay, yes.
Are we announcing our names? What do you want us to do? Okay. I'm a PhD retired scientist and live in Montgomery County. And my wife's been a teacher there forever. She's now going to retire after working at University of Maryland. And one of the things that I think that you're emphasizing, which is accurate, is inertia at the states, in the educational facilities, in teachers, in their training, and in behavior. And so, yes, there's urgency. I see a very deliberate attempt at process. But the ultimate goal is teaching students about science.
Mm-hmm.
I think the only way that you can continue to deal with the inertia that's inevitable is to come up with some really excellent case studies of where you've done it, it works, it makes a difference, and you flash it in front of people all the time. Find more and more of them.
Okay, is that on the list?
Can I respond to that? As far as our district, just some of you may know, we actually have a partnership with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and part of that work is actually we have a team of teachers, and again, one of them will be on the panel today, working on professional development around the practices. And part of our work there is actually our Office of Shared Accountability is doing an evaluation of the work, and we're trying to drill down to impact on students if teachers are focusing on the practices in their classroom, the gains in student learning. So we're hoping to have it'll be a small study, but at least a starting point. So, because we've been pushed by Howard Hughes, they think it's great, the conversations we're having, the work they're doing, to try to get something that could maybe spawn other research or be published. So that's a very small scale, but that's our initial work.
And we've actually had conversations with several different organizations and individuals who want to start this kind of project, to have the kinds of cases that are compelling, that everything from at the classroom level so people understand what it means to employ the practices in your teaching, but all the way up to what are the successful, how do you do this successfully across a school or across a district. So there's some discussion of it. I think it's a fantastic idea. And in fact, the book that Anita has, Ready, Set, Science, was early, predated the framework, has cases of instruction in it, along with, inspired by the same kind of thing. You've got to see it, and when you see it, it's pretty compelling. It's a great idea.
Okay, all right.
Hi, I'm an engineer. I partner with scientists. That's a lot of fun. My question is, I've seen so many things, being an engineer on that side of it, when's it going to work, and how is what you brought up regarding infrastructure. And I'd like you to talk about that, because what I see, there's just not enough retired scientists to go in every school and do this work. That's one of the problems there. So what is the infrastructure, and how do you envision that? What does that mean?
When I talk about infrastructure, it's extremely multifaceted. And really they all are geared around teacher and student supports, I think. How do we build a structure to handle the practicing teacher? How do we help the pre-service teacher? Obviously, the end result, as the gentleman said over here, is getting the students on the right page. Well, to do that, we've got to help our teachers get there first. I really believe that we have some of the greatest teachers in the world in this country, and I really believe that everything that's in the framework and what will subsequently be in the standards is being done somewhere in the U.S., but it may not be done all at the same time and all done well all the time. So when I talk about infrastructure, what has typically happened with states is they have a new set of standards and they run a year of professional development for teachers. And it focuses on, well, here's what's different. This move from 4th grade to 5th grade. And do some inquiry. And here, let's do some fun stuff here while you're here. And what I'm talking about is a much more comprehensive perspective of building the ability for teachers to actively engage in understanding that bigger picture, for one, very similar to what Anita's been describing, and targeting, so from a state level, targeting the issues that may be the most different. And I think in the case of NGSS, it's going to be pretty much everything. helping work with their districts to identify those people within the district, like yourself maybe, who can go into the districts and help. But I'm kind of talking around it a lot, but it's such a huge thing that we've just really not ever tackled. You know, we've done a superficial job of implementation, and implementation fails. And what we've got to do is find a way to support our teachers in a way that will make them more effective.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, my name's Alan Rubin. I'm an engineer, mechanical engineer, retired, and I've been working with the volunteer programs in Montgomery County Schools. This is the 4th year. Being an engineer, I have some practical questions, actually 2 parts. One is, what kind of a time frame do you see for actually implementation of these standards into the school systems, where the teachers are actually using them and they've bought into it? And secondly, in these days of extremely tight budgets, both state, county-wide, across the country, what kind of resources are going to be needed to either train the teachers, get these plans in place, things like that? Have those things been thought about?
Oh, every day.
Yeah, okay. But it haven't been discussed here yet.
Honestly, I think about it every day, every night. But it's, so yeah, there's no doubt. Well, let me start with your implementation question. So we are planning on being finished by sometime in the first quarter of 2013. So we have some states like California, for instance, that actually has in their state statute that they have to take a set of standards to the state board by March of 2013 and then go through a process and then either approve, reject, or modify a set of standards by the end of July. And they are all supposed to be based on the next generation science standards. Well, we're not going to finish a whole lot before March 2013, so they're pretty much going to take those standards. You've got New York, who they're on a fast train with their Race to the Top funds. So I think there's going to be some early implementers that are out ahead because they may have additional resources or they have some political pressures to move on things. That's why we're trying to have the conversations around those 4 quadrants right now. As far as resources go, you know, you look at states and you see states that have done a really effective job, like Massachusetts, with their professional development. They've put a great deal of time, effort, and funds into the training of their teachers. I can't give you a number because obviously it's going to fluctuate depending on how many teachers are in your state and frankly the level needed. Again, I'm more intimately involved with Montgomery County Schools because my son and daughter go there. I would fair to say that their implementation would be probably more smooth and more be able to go quicker than some districts that I've been in where they've got just a lot of work to do.
When I think also talking about resources, I think this is the time that you look at the resources that you have, limited or not, and you use them differently. Yeah. You know, so, and it's very difficult sometimes for people to let go some of the things, oh, we've always done, yeah, you know, the summer this or the summer that, but you look at how you use the resources you have differently that are going to, so that they can be more impactful. You look at different means of delivery of professional development. Right. I know in our case, as we write curriculum and it goes into an online platform, we're trying to develop modules that can be used in an ongoing manner by teachers. It allows teachers to revisit the professional development. It can be just in time if they've forgotten a key piece, but it's not just relying on, you heard it, the one and done, and we expect you to now you're a new person or you know this new skill. It really has to be ongoing. So it's really an examination of the limited resources and trying to be very creative to have the most impact.
Yeah, I think that that's right on, in the sense that there's more resources within the system. It is a matter of rethinking how it gets used. I am part of a project, vice chair of the board of something called Digital Promise. And in that particular case, you're looking at this whole notion about the role, can technology be a powerful tool to help to move some of this along? One of the good pieces of news that I saw, I had a chance to look at the draft, was that there is consistency with regard to the life sciences between the document that I'm holding here, Vision and Change, which it was a document that was developed by the biological sciences community to talk about undergraduate life sciences, that there is consistency between what's here and what's there. Because if we get different kinds of expectations going at the same time, then that's really a recipe for disaster. So that's, that's a kind of a net positive with regard to the situating of these draft standards in the larger discussions within the disciplinary communities. Yes,
Well,
ma'am.
and that's where the college and career ready validation is going to be really critical, because we're bringing together, starting in June, a group of about 100 post-secondary faculty to look at the draft high school standards and what they're doing in their entry-level courses to see, is there actually some congruence?
Yeah. Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Stiano. I'm in the AAAS Development Office, so I'm going to preface my question by saying that I'm very new to the world of science education, so I don't want to embarrass Shirley with any ignorant questions. But building on, I think, something that you had said, Steve, I thought it was very, very nice that you gave us kind of an action item that, we can leverage our voices to move this dialogue forward. But it seems to me there are so many players in this world of advancing science education. How do you need to be engaging those players, both, I guess, in the nonprofit world and all the different people who are doing all these different things, and also to your point about corporations who have so much leverage because they have the cash, let's face it. How are they involved in the mix? Have they been part of developing these new standards, and what do they need to be doing, or what do we need to be doing to engage them around this?
So we have partnered with Battelle, and Battelle is actually helping the 26 lead states build coalitions within their states that include the big companies in their states and the scientists in their states. It's an ongoing thing, but right now, for instance, we have a business support letter that's going around that CEOs in the various states are signing on, that they support the process of the NGSS. We have a similar letter going around through higher ed right now that they support the process of NGSS. So we're already engaging a lot of that, but you can't do it all. I mean, I think if you don't hear anything else I say today, it would be great if you could hear this part, that we can all have our little disagreements about what we think something ought to say or how it should be worded, but if we all have the same focus and we're all pulling the same direction, even if I'm not totally happy with every single word, but I know that that this will at least move the ball down the field, it can be an incredibly powerful movement for a state education agency to see a group of people in the stands, so to speak, saying, look, you're going the right way. Because the interesting thing, and this is going to happen with Common Core, you mark my words, the math Common Core is going to really scare a lot of people, because all of a sudden kids are going to come home from school and they're not making A's anymore, and they're not, and clearly at that point, because I've lived in this, okay, in Georgia we raised our math standards, and I mean, it's easy to say you raised them when you didn't have any to start with, I suppose, but we had really low math standards, and so we really ramped them up. The pushback didn't come from the business community. It didn't come from the, it really came back some from the teachers, but not as much. It came from the communities where the schools are located, where mamas and daddies said, wait, Johnny's making a C, he's always made A's. Clearly there's something wrong with the math. Clearly the teachers aren't trained. Clearly, there's a million reasons. And if people in the community, like yourselves, that are the scientists, that are the business leaders, stand up and say, you know what, that's okay. You're being honest with kids. We're actually holding them to a higher level of accountability. Because I tell people all the time, with Common Core math, this is not going to be like ripping off a Band-Aid. It's kind of like a prolonged illness for a while. We're going to recover and we're going to do great, but it's not going to be, painless. It's going to be something we're going to have to heal from.
One of the couple of issues as we close. One major thing is that while we're just focused on the science standards, then there's a common core over here for mathematics, and then there's a common core for English language arts. There is this larger issue of the system, the school as a system that is being asked to make these kinds of tsunamic changes. Because you cannot, with that kind of a reframing, do things the same way that you've always done it. The other piece is that it may take more time, and it may take time for learning that is beyond the school day. So there is this kind of taking a village attitude that may have to creep into the way that we frame it when we talk about it. So how have any efforts, what efforts, if any, have been made to actually prepare the leadership as well as the public for the notion that it may not just be the science class or the math class or the English class that has to change, but the way that we structure the relationships across teachers, across grade levels, across school resources, and what have you.
Well, I mean, I can say that's actually taken up explicitly in the framework when there's a discussion of implementation, is this notion of a system. And part of that is an acknowledgement that we actually had pretty good standards in the 90s. They were pretty good at the national level, and they were translated, and part of why we didn't see the vision become reality was failures of implementation. And so that we have a chance now to think that through more, but to think it through with an approach that recognizes there's a complex system here of multiple layers and multiple actors, and thinking more carefully about how they're connected. And so actually a lot of the work that Achieve is doing at the state level and with different stakeholders is acknowledging that it's a system and that the state's a really important player. We, for example, given that we connect to the scientific community at the National Research Council, we've actually worked with some of the professional societies in the sciences to start raising awareness and saying, what are your roles? And for example, to say, well, you could be champions at your state and local level so that you can become these advocates that Stephen is talking about. We've actually had a meeting with textbook publishers and for-profit curriculum developers, 2 meetings, to start talking about them as an actor in the system and how they might need to respond to this. So we've actually been trying to frame that, and I think as states put together plans, they're going to need to be thinking more systemically too, to say this all has to move together or it's just going to fall apart.
Well, yeah.
And I think at a system level, there are a lot of things, you're talking about implementation plan. You have to put together a communication plan. And, we have things like parent academies where parents come and hear about, what the new wave is. We have administrator meetings. Again, the purpose is to try to educate as many stakeholders as possible so that everybody's, it's kind of like herding cats, trying to get everybody going in the same direction. But you have to start with the information. And so part of that implementation plan is a very detailed communication plan, thinking about all stakeholders that need that information.
Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And so we will exit stage left and right and give the opportunity to bring on Don Ray, who's going to take over my role as facilitator and who is going to have a new panel here that talks about how we can support each other in terms of making these good things happen.